The Americans made it very clear, no missiles, no nukes. The Iranians wouldn't agree to it. Trump gave them a clock. When the clock expired, Israel would give them permission to strike the very next day. We're seeing a very logical progression of targets, very surgical, and militarily it makes perfect sense. The strike on the first morning, taking out the entirety of the Iranian government, essentially what we call dislocates their command and control. You make it very, very difficult for them to pass orders around. Well, I think a bigger hit that we saw for Midnight Hammer, I suspect something like that is coming in due course.
On both the right and the left, there is this growing idea that this small, plucky Jewish state is actually controlling world affairs and the master of the West.
There's not an altruism. America aren't just doing this because they love Israel. There's a very clear strategic objective, and that's to do with the isolation of China. Trump was elected to be the peace president, no more wars, and he's dropped more bombs than almost anyone else.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Andrew Fox. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hi Brendan, how you do?
Great to have you back on. I won't give listeners any prizes for guessing what we're about to talk about. Iran, a huge geopolitical event. I mean, one of the largest of recent times, no question about that. And I guess there's lots I want to ask you about it, but let's kick off with a broad question, which is, what are your kind of basic feelings about it? Is it scary? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it all of the above? How are you viewing this situation right now?
Look, it's too soon to say is the bottom line. We know some very, very impressive military stuff has happened. I think the strike on the first morning, taking out the entirety of the Iranian government, was an incredible piece of what we call fusion. The way they brought the intelligence and the operational planning together to achieve that military effect in such a tight window, it was very impressive. Also monumentally stupid on the Iranian side. I mean, if I'm honest, if I have a bunker that takes 5 minutes to get to in a lift, and I have 2 American carrier groups parked on my doorstep and I know they want to get me, I'm probably not going up to the surface for a meeting with all my mates. That's a monumentally stupid decision by them, but also gives an insight, I think, into how the regime thinks and why they'll be so difficult to remove completely. And the insight is that they don't think like we do. They have a very fundamentalist worldview, and they're not cosplaying being jihadis. They don't have a pragmatism like say for example al-Sharaa in Syria. They can't be bought off easily. They can't be deterred particularly easily. They must have known there's no way they could go toe to toe with Israel and the US militarily. And yet they still wouldn't agree to a relatively reasonable deal that Trump was offering them. And that means it's going to be really, really difficult to pick them out because this fanaticism, this religious obsession goes all the way down the chain. And I don't know if you've seen any of Qasr Arabi's stuff, but his links into the IRGC are incredible. And he showed that almost 40% of the IRGC's training is on indoctrination. It's not on military skills. It's not on how to shoot crowds with machine guns. It's on how to be an absolutely devout, fanatic follower of the mullah. So they're going to be really, really hard to dig out. And my final point is the reason it's hard to answer your question is because the end state is therefore very unclear. Like if they just go for a mission where they take out the whole government, take out the missile supplies, take out any nuclear program they can, and then leave it, that might be an option. But the regime will almost certainly survive. If they decide to push for a full regime change and have somebody else in charge, that's going to be a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people's feelings right now. Military stuff far better than I do. You study this stuff, you've fought in wars. It seems to me, very much as a layperson, that it has been quite forensic so far. I mean, there have been some mistakes. There have been what look like civilian catastrophes, as far as we can tell. But it does look forensic in terms of who's being targeted and how they're being targeted. Is that your reading? Is the attempt to decapitate the regime? How are you understanding that kind of the forensic nature of what's been taking place so far?
Yeah, and in the social media age, it's really difficult to get a handle on that if you don't know the sort of what you're looking for in the wider background. And it's the trap that was so easily exploited by Hamas in Gaza, where lots of airstrikes that you see on your phone kind of looks like they're leveling the whole place. And that's not the case at all. They're reporting about 555 deaths last time I checked. That's probably gone up overnight, but that's still surprisingly low for the number of missions flown, for the number of bombs dropped. That's actually an incredibly low death toll. Actually, the same as Gaza, in all honesty. There's far below one death for every munition dropped in Gaza. But it's very easy to spin that into something else. So yes, and I think the target decks that we're seeing emerge, it makes sense. So you start with the leadership. You essentially what we call dislocate their command and control. You make it very, very difficult for them to pass orders around, and make decisions quickly and effectively. And that was done on day one. And I think we're seeing elements of that by the sporadic nature of the way they're flailing around with missile launches at random states in the Gulf. That doesn't feel particularly coordinated or planned, particularly the stuff at Cyprus. That makes no sense at all. The target deck then moves to IRGC sites, the security apparatus, missile launches, and probably nuclear sites is coming. I don't think they've hit them yet. I know the B2s have been operational, but Iran has so much stuff underground. Those B2s are going to be busy if they want to achieve even the most basic aims of taking out the missile sites and the nuclear sites. But I think a bigger hit that we saw, for Midnight Hammer, that huge B2 raid last summer, where they dropped massive ordnance penetrators on Fordo. I suspect something like that is coming in due course, but it's not the immediate priority. So we're seeing a very logical progression of targets, very surgical, and militarily it makes perfect sense.
So before we get into a bit more about the operation itself and the likely consequences or possible consequences of it, you've mentioned the deal making that was going on between the US and Iran and various parties involved in these discussions. The reading amongst lots of observers in the media, who are not always the most reliable people, but the reading is that this was a typical discussion between two parties, and then America and Israel went and screwed it up by killing everyone. I mean, that's how it's been presented to us. How do you understand that kind of process of deal making? What went wrong there, and why did the strikes follow quite quickly on from that?
Well, I think it falls back to that fanaticism on the Iranian side. Look, we've been down this pathway before. It's a kind of replay of last summer's negotiations, where Trump gave them a clock. When the clock expired, Israel were given permission to strike the very next day. And we saw that again here. They've had 2 rounds, was it 3, of negotiations. The Americans made it very clear, no missiles, no nukes. The Iranians wouldn't agree to it. They walked away from those talks, and Trump hit go the next morning. Now, the timing perhaps wasn't as Trump-driven as last summer, where he said, right, I've had enough, the clock's up, go. Because there is a suggestion that the intelligence came together for this meeting to hit all of the commanders at once, and that was what accelerated the timeline slightly. But if you're in think about this, if you're in a negotiation and you know the other side is stalling, you know the other side isn't going to agree, and you might have talks planned for another week's time, but you suddenly get this incredible opportunity where they come up to the surface from their bunkers and they all get together in the same place. If you know war's going to happen sooner or later, and you get a target of that kind, you might as well just go sooner. So it makes sense to me. And I don't buy the whole Bibi persuaded Trump nonsense. It's just I think people have an axe to grind with Israel and like to attribute the most malign motive at any given opportunity. But if we strip that away, militarily, this just makes good sense, quite frankly.
Let's talk a little bit then about America and Israel and the relationship there, because one of the interpretations, of course, and you could have guessed this months in advance that this would be the interpretation, which is that Israel is bouncing everyone into yet another one of its wars, kind of leading Trump by the nose and forcing the West to bow down and do its bidding in the Middle East. Now, of course, Israel has a very clear, rational interest in dislodging the axis of resistance, right from the Islamic, the Ayatollah down. No one would doubt that. No one would deny that this is a clear national interest issue for Israel. But how have you understood those discussions, those representations of what's going on? What is the relationship like from your perspective?
Look, they're incredibly tight, and I think both sides have clear strategic interests that actually aren't completely aligned. There's not an altruism. America aren't just doing this because they love Israel. There's a very clear strategic objective, and that's to do with the isolation of China. And we saw this with Venezuela, where they were happy just to do a 1-for-1 swap with the guy in charge. replace Maduro with Rodriguez, and you've got everything intact, but it's now American facing rather than Chinese facing. Great. That was a very surgical op. If you can do the same with Iran in some form or another, I think it's something between 20 and 40% of China's oil supply is now American friendly. That doesn't mean they're going to, escalate things with China. It just means they've got a hell of a lot more leverage when they come to negotiations. So that makes a lot of sense from the American side. On the plus side, it helps Israel out as well and helps them hopefully conclude this war they've been in for, well, at least since 7th of October, if not before.
Just on the home front question for a moment, it does seem like on both the right and the left, there is this growing idea that Israel, are you going to die for Israel or not? I mean, this is the cry that people make now. The presumption being that Israel really is the master of the Western world. I mean, it's hard to avoid seeing a kind of prejudiced theme running through that. This notion that this small, plucky Jewish state is actually controlling world affairs. I mean, it does get quite ugly at times, doesn't it? Especially when you look at the crank right in America and I guess the woke left in Europe. There is this kind of fusion between them around the idea that Israel is the kind of destroyer of world affairs and the master of the West.
So yeah, there is, this is just straight up anti-Semitism. It goes back 2,000 years of, Jews running the world. It's not new. It's just taken on a different set of clothes, I think. And look, it's also completely factually illiterate because it's undeniable what happened on 7th of October, no matter how much people do try and deny it. The facts are there, and the fact is it came from Iran. And every part of Israel's war since 7th of October has all been connected to Iran. We've heard the head of the octopus or the head of the snake, whatever you want to call it. Iran has been pulling the strings here. Hamas were their allies. Hamas's Al-Aqsa banner was raised in Tehran on the day. So it's not as if they didn't know that it was coming. Unless Iranian banner manufacturers are much, much quicker than perhaps you'd expect. It's not a 48-hour turnaround. They had it good to go. Hezbollah in Lebanon, they've even got IRGC commanders with them now. They uplifted their command structure in Lebanon in anticipation of this. And the Israelis have had to hit them and hit them and hit them. They forget that straight after 7th of October, 10,000 people were evacuated from northern Israel and couldn't stay in their homes because of Hezbollah rocket fire. The Syrian angle is different. The Iraqi militias are causing problems right now. They've been attacking the US embassy, and there is a real threat from the militias in Iraq. There's almost as many Iranian-backed militias in Iraq as there are Iraqi national troops. They are a big problem. They've been deterred so far by American presence. How long that's going to last, we don't know. That's one of the big escalatory risks of what's happening now. And then, of course, the Houthis in Yemen, West Bank and Gaza, and then everything behind this was Iran. So in terms of casus belli, the reason for going to war, Israel is about as locked on as it possibly could be. So to just say this is Israel pulling strings and causing wars for no reason, it's just straight up anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's very well put. I mean, when I see people saying that Israel is launching an unprovoked war of aggression against Iran, you just think, what? I mean, that's just the levels of denialism are just unbelievable. They really are. In relation to 7th of October itself, I'm glad you mentioned 7th of October because people's unwillingness to talk about it. And, one can argue that Israel's beef with Iran goes back long before 7th of October. And technically, I guess people are right when they say this didn't start on 7th of October, although people tend to say that because they want to blame Israel for everything. But technically, they're right. This conflict's been going on for a long time. But the unwillingness to talk about the escalation that 7th of October represented is very, very telling. What do you make, as someone who understands military strategy better than most, what do you make of 7th of October? It seems to me to be the most suicidal mission in modern history. The IDF posted on Instagram yesterday a picture of the Ayatollah Sinwar of Hamas and Nasrallah of Hezbollah, basically the axis of resistance, the IDF essentially saying bye-bye. I mean, it is extraordinary what, I guess, Iranian radical Islamism has suffered post 7th of October, isn't it?
It is. It's extraordinary on two levels. First of all, it was an extraordinary miscalculation on their part. And secondly, an extraordinary military achievement by Israel, on the other hand. And we can't underrate that either. But if you look at Sinwar's plan for 7th of October from Hamas in Gaza, they found documents on his fighters showing maps and that kind of thing, plans, and they were going to try and get as far into Jerusalem and as far into Tel Aviv as they could and slaughter everyone. There was no kind of big tactic here, and their working assumption was that the West Bank would rise up, that Lebanon, Hezbollah would rise up, and they would then swamp Israel from multiple directions all at once. And now the most important decision on 7th of October was taken quite early on, and that was to move a few divisions north to the northern border. And I think had that not happened, you would have seen Hezbollah's Radwan forces launching over the border and doing kind of 7th of October Part 2. But they were deterred by that very early move of divisions north. And that changed the whole thing. That bought Israel some time to mop up what was going on down in the Gaza periphery. And then we saw that incredible domino procession of Israel's enemies falling one by one over the next sort of 2.5 years. And, I was speaking to Yoav Gallant, who was the old defense minister for Israel, just the other day, and I asked him what he thought Israel could have done differently. And his only kind of thing was that they might have gone for Hezbollah a bit sooner. But other than that, Israel have played this perfectly, probably except in Gaza, where they couldn't find an end state. They couldn't find that political end state they were working towards. And it's the same problem I think they're going to face in Iran now, that they are up against absolute fundamentalists who don't know when they're beaten, and have a very different kind of way of seeing the world to a conventional enemy that will put down their arms and surrender when you've killed enough of them. That doesn't happen with these people. And that's my big concern about Iran, is that we're having a replay of Gaza, but on a much, much bigger scale.
So let's talk a bit about what might happen in Iran. I mean, you mentioned earlier that at the moment it seems quite forensic. The death toll, relatively speaking, is quite low given the amount of assaults that have been launched so far. The leadership has been taken out quite successfully. That doesn't mean the regime has fallen, of course. Everyone is pretty aware of that. In your view, what would be the ideal outcome? Would the ideal outcome be the weakening of the regime and compelling them to compromise in some way rather than regime change? What would you prefer to see happen?
Yeah, it's a tough question, actually, because there are an awful lot of unknown variables here. But let's talk through two scenarios, and that'll give people a sense of where it could go. I think that probably might make sense. So scenario one is they degrade their missile launcher capability, they degrade the military capability, they degrade the nuclear capability, and they make sure that all of the old headshed, all of the old commanders that were so responsible for this are removed completely. Now, you then walk away, and it's down to the Iranian people to see what happens next. The regime probably stay in charge in that case, but much, much weakened. Maybe not chastened, but certainly unable to pose a huge risk going forward. That's not a great outcome for the people of Iran. They still remain under the cosh of a horrible dictatorship, but it does bring the war to an end quickly, and relatively in a straightforward manner. Option two is if you push ahead for full regime change. Now, in the military, we talk about ends and means. So your ends is where you want to get to, and the means is how you get there. And essentially, for a campaign plan, they have to align. If we're looking at regime change, at the moment, those ends and means don't align. You can't do regime change just from the air. You need something on the ground. And I think in the back of the planners' minds right now will be somebody on the ground in Iran now who'll be able to take over when they create enough of a void of security and governments that somebody else can rise up and take over. I'd be astonished if there weren't kind of CIA, Mossad, maybe special forces on the ground with their chosen group ready to go once the security structure is degraded from the air, once governance starts to fall apart on the regime side, ready to go and seize somewhere. It won't be the whole country at once. It'll be a key urban centre, be that Tehran or one of the other cities. And once you've managed to seize control of that, you can kind of ink blot outwards from there and establish control, because there will be a rump of regime loyalists who will try and fight you. It might be an insurgency. It might be a straight up fight. You have to have a figure that people can rally around if you're trying to expand your governance. Is that Pahlavi? Who knows? Certainly the PR campaign says that Iranians want him. That hasn't been the case previously, so that's up in the air and yet to be seen. And if that option goes ahead, then this is a very long and protracted process that will need continual air support. I don't see British, American, Israeli, anyone boots on the ground. I think it is an Iranian solution to an Iranian problem. But essentially, the two options we've got are a quick finish where you're happy with a certain percentage of success, or you go for the full 100% regime change, which will take an awful lot more time, money, lives, and will cause a fair amount of chaos as well. So which would I personally prefer? Well, I'm torn between being an analyst who thinks that the first option is probably best versus being somebody who despises the Iranian regime, wants the Iranian people free, and really hopes they can make that second option happen. So kind of I'm torn between the two halves of my brain on that one.
Yeah, I expect that's how a lot of people feel, which is that they want this regime gone and they want the Iranian people to be free, but they also recognize that that's a tough prospect and one that would involve potentially a lot of instability, a lot of conflict, a lot of boots on the ground. I mean, it's not an easy thing to achieve. So yeah, I think a lot of people will be thinking, get rid of the theocracy, but that's easier said than done. An Iranian solution to an Iranian problem, I think, is probably the best way to describe it. What we would like to see. Um, you will know from reading and talking to people that there's a lot of trepidation in the West about getting bogged down in another regime change war. I mean, I haven't seen much polling yet, but it does seem to be something that worries a lot of people in America, worries a lot of people in Britain. And of course, the specter of Iraq is always brought up. I mean, it's almost like the only purpose Iraq serves now in public discussion is as a warning against ever doing anything. It really has become this symbol of, don't ever take any action because look what happened in Iraq. What are you making of that discussion? I mean, people obviously have legitimate concerns about precisely the kind of things you've just talked about, what regime change would entail. But what do you make of the broader discussion about, and especially the way that in which Iraq is used to kind of shut down any form of action at all?
Yeah, and look, Iraq was a great example of ends and means not aligning, and also blundering incompetence. I wrote my master's dissertation partly on everything that went wrong in Iraq, and I don't have time now to cover 25,000 words, but let's just say everything that we shouldn't have done, we did, and everything we should have done, we didn't do. So it was a catastrophe start to finish. Now, opinion polling, I have looked. I was looking just before I came on. It's about 1 in 4 Americans support this. It's actually surprisingly few. Trump was elected to be the peace president. No more wars, and he's dropped more bombs than almost anyone else in recent presidential history. So he's gonna have to juggle his base. And look, there are 3 things I think that bring this to an end quickly. First is time, which is the fact that this is an election year. This can't afford to go on too long. The closer we get to the elections, the less Mr. Trump will want this to be going. There is ammunition is a big question. We don't know how many missile interceptor stocks the Gulf states have, but you can look at how many they've ordered. You can find that on the congressional website. And at the current rate of fire, for example, Qatar's got 4 days of interceptor stocks left, and the UAE has 7. Now, the rate of fire may well go down as Israel and America degrade the launch and missile capability, so that might extend the timeline, but it's not going to extend it hugely. So I think there is a ticking clock on ammunition stores, unless they manage to rustle some up from somewhere. And I know they're talking about bringing Patriot missiles across from South Korea to try and backfill all the expenditure they've had. I think that's the scale of rounds against the Gulf states, I think, has caught them out a little bit. And that definitely puts a hard stop on this, because if they run out of air defense missiles and Iran is still firing them, then that's a horrible possibility. A lot of people could be killed in those states. So that's a factor. So time, ammunition, and then really kind of where you're going with this. The markets are going to react. You are operating in, unfortunately, one of the world's most oil-rich regions. Anything you do is going to impact barrel price. We're at $80 now, just about. It's actually been less of a rise than people were worried, but it is going to go up. That means people are going to be paying more at the petrol station. And not only that, everything we touch is to do with the petroleum industry. Like half our clothes contain byproducts from it. Everything is going to get more expensive as that barrel price goes up. And that could make this war phenomenally unpopular, particularly in the United States, where that barrel price, that how much you're paying for a gallon of gas is one of those sort of, it's their equivalent of a pint of milk for us. It's a totemic thing. And so those 3 factors together, I think, do put a kind of a ticking clock on this conflict, and it'll end sooner rather than later.
In relation to the ticking clock aspect, I did want to ask you about Trump as well. I know you're pretty skeptical about Trump, as we are at Spiked as well. We're not Trump fanboys. I also hope we don't suffer from Trump derangement syndrome. We kind of try and steer a path between those two things. Um, you said that he was elected to be the peace president. He was going to stop regime change wars, yeah, put an end to all those kind of adventures that we've seen over the past 20 or 25 years. Um, do, do you think he's betrayed that by taking this action, or is this something that is quite discreet and that he could justify as being something that's within the American interest rather than an expansive boots on the ground war that we've seen previously? Is he going back on his word, or do you not see it like that?
No, I don't. And, and I dislike Trump as much as anyone. His comments about our performance in Afghanistan were pretty below the belt, frankly. So I've got no time for the guy. But look, even a defanged Iranian regime makes the world a safer place. He is doing us a favor here, and I support what they're trying to do. Like I said, that as an analyst, I can see problems going forward, but as a broad concept, any kind of weakening of Iran is a good thing for everyone. Their proxies like Hezbollah are one of the main sponsors of drug running, weapons running, people smuggling into Europe. They've got a huge footprint in South America where they cause all sorts of misery for people down there as well. They are an objectively bad country, and the more of them in that regime who are taken off the playing field, frankly, the better. So I think that's a good thing, and it should be a straightforward sell on those terms. Like, this is making the world safer. Yes, it's costing. I think it's costed 2.2 billion or something so far in 3 days. I mean, it's a lot of money, but like that's money well spent for America, because the more peaceful the world is, the more prosperous America can be. So that's how I'd sell it if I were the president. And again, I do think it puts that pressure on for this to be a short, sharp war rather than something protracted and enduring, which makes, I suspect, my first option that I outlined a bit more likely.
Let's talk a bit about America's relationship with Europe, because that has been in a bad way over recent months, partly because of Trump's comments on Afghanistan, but also the Greenland issue, the NATO question, just a general sense of tension between these two continents and a fraying of old bonds. That seems to have impacted on the Iran mission to a certain extent. I mean, Starmer was reluctant for a period to commit. He still seems to be a bit kind of on the fence or unclear about what his strategy is. Spain is backing out. There is a kind of skepticism across Europe, I think, in relation to this. Who do you hold responsible for that? Do you think there's an alternative universe where there was more commonality between America and Europe on the question of Iran?
Yeah, I think if Trump had taken a different tone over the last year and a bit, I think this could have gone very differently. Unfortunately, they've gone in like a wrecking ball. They've insisted that we take sole responsibility for Ukraine, and we have. We've done what we were asked to do. But unfortunately, that leaves our locker a bit dry. It's as simple as that. Look, we've got two major conflicts here. One is on our doorstep and one isn't. So we've been told to prioritize Ukraine, and we have. It's that straightforward. And look, you can't go around the world abusing and insulting other countries and then expect them just to agree with you and crack on. And I thought Hegseth's comments yesterday were particularly poor from the American side. The bottom line is you either treat your allies like allies or you don't. And if you don't, then you don't expect them to play as nicely as they used to. And this isn't rocket science. And I don't think the Americans should be particularly surprised at what they're seeing. Like, this is what you wanted, and there you have it. We're detaching ourselves from America on a security front, and that means we don't come and play with you every time you want us to do something. It seems fairly logical to me. But when it comes to Starmer particularly, I think he has magnificently made probably the right decision for the wrong reasons, and then he's managed it incredibly badly to make himself look as weak as possible. It's I don't see a need for us to be involved. That we're not wanted or needed. Like the Israelis and the Americans have got this, frankly. Like, anything extra would just be a bit of kind of gilding the lily. So we can focus on defending Cyprus and keeping going with Ukraine. But for Starmer to say it's because of international law is very funny. It's like, my goodness, are you still this slavish to this thing that has been weaponized against us for the last 2 years, weaponized against Israel? And essentially what he said yesterday was astonishing. It was like, well, if I sent British troops to this war, then the implication was then maybe he'd have to prosecute them further down the line. You know, that was the unspoken piece here. It's like, "Oh, it's an illegal war. If I send them, then that's not fair to them." Then the dot, 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 and fill in the gaps because they get prosecuted by people like me. Just an astonishing way of seeing the world where you consistently put international law ahead of any national interest, no matter what the circumstances or situation.
Yeah, when I see people talking about international law in that way, I just want to grab them by the scruff of the neck. I can't believe they're still playing that game when, as you say, it so clearly hampers any pursuit of the national interest, or just, it disguises the reality of the world as well, which is that sometimes there are conflicts because there are clashing, competing interests. Um, i- just on Starmer, um, you say he's made the right decision, but for the wrong reasons. And do you think there's any truth in the idea that he is being, I think it's understandable that Europe is a bit pissed off with America, given all the commentary and conflict of the past year and a half. But do you think there's truth in the accusation that Starmer is weak, generally speaking? I mean, because, the thing that I keep thinking is that um, regardless of whether Britain would want to actually send fighters over there to do this stuff, which I think people will have different opinions on, it is an opportunity for the UK to say what we think about the Iranian regime, what we think about civilized values, what we think about the importance of defending the democratic nation of Israel, our friend and ally. There is that space to make some clear moral statements, which are kind of notable by their absence at the moment. What do you think's going on, I guess, morally and politically in relation to the Starmer government?
I mean, politically, it's interesting because, and I'm just calling up the poll now. I did check the stats on UK support for this just the other day. And yeah, people were asked last summer about supporting what was going on between Iran and Israel. 5% thought we should back Iran, which in itself is quite worrying, even that 5% did. But only 19% said back Israel. 50% said neither. 25% said don't know. So it's a bare minimum 75% of the country is in the don't know or don't care category. Um, and that is something a politician is always going to take into account, unfortunately, especially when you've just lost a major by-election to the insurgent party to your left flank. So that electoral calculus is going through Starmer's head, and I don't blame him for that necessarily. That's how politicians operate. And if it was a Conservative PM with a right-wing insurgent, it'd be the same. So I get that. But when it comes to where we are in the Middle East, look, we don't have the capability for this. Like, we do have F-35s, we do have the Typhoons. They're very capable aircraft, but we do have also that massive security threat on our doorstep. And if we start bleeding resources over to the Middle East at scale, that will be seen as an opportunity by Putin to push in a different direction to the Ukrainian one. And it does leave us weakened, unfortunately. We don't have the assets to maintain a really solid ability to strike Russian troops at the same time as we're in Tehran. And whilst it's very nice to say that we support the principles of freedom and democracy, and we want to see Iran in a better place, like I said, at a tactical level, Israel and the US have it. Nothing we add is going to make it go any better. So why put ourselves in a weakened position for effectively no gain other than virtue signaling? So that's my kind of take on it. So I'm a bit more skeptical than perhaps some commentators are.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a point well made. Just want to ask you a couple more questions about the home front and I guess what's going on within our nations. You mentioned the 5% there who said that they would have supported Iran versus Israel, which is terrifying. Small number, but still terrifying. But even beyond that 5% who would openly support the Islamic Republic, there are, of course, as we've seen over the past 2.5 years, many people who are willing to take to the streets to make apologies for Hamas, to make apologies for Hezbollah, to chant in favor of the Houthis when they were bombing commercial ships in the Red Sea, and of course to scream blue murder about Israel morning, noon, and night. And I just wonder what impact, because I don't want to compare anyone to Nazi Germany or anything like that. That's not what I'm doing now. That's never a very useful thing. But it does feel to me like, imagine if we were going to war against the Nazis in Europe and there were lots of people in the UK who were sympathetic to Germany or sympathetic to some of these movements, or who said it's Germanophobia if you raise any criticisms of these regimes and the way they think. And it does feel a bit like that's the kind of culture, not across society, of course, but in influential sections of it. What impact do you think that has on just getting allowing people to have a clear understanding of the threat that the Iranian regime poses, or the importance of Israel winning? I mean, it's so hard to get through to people on that question because of that culture of apologism that exists in British society.
Yeah, well, of course, we had, people like Mosley and the Mitfords, who were pro-Hitler, and they were interned quite rightly at the start of the war, but they were a slack handful in number rather than the thousands that we've seen on the streets cheering for people that want us dead. It's genuinely been a mind-blowing 2 years, and I think it speaks to a couple of things. First of which is the way our information commons have been completely polluted. And the piece I wrote for Spikes yesterday, I make this point: when people no longer trust the mainstream media, they go to places like X, which are actually vastly more unreliable than the mainstream media. And you have to actually have genuine skills to know what you're looking at, and do research and source analysis and be able to cross-check facts. And that's all the stuff that journalists used to do before it became a slightly more polluted environment politically, in journalism. It's a real shame that doesn't happen, because now people are getting what they want to see, because the algorithm pushes you towards your own stovepipe. It rewards outrage. It rewards you for liking stuff that's already in your sphere. And it means we're creating these almost alternative perceptions, these alternative realities, where people genuinely think there's a genocide in Gaza because they've heard it said again and again and again by people they like and in their social circle. So, in terms of like meaning of words, genocide has completely changed its meaning, and become unanchored from the legal framework to basically mean I don't like seeing killing in a war. So we're in that very strange space where we can't even talk the same language to each other now, because words are taking on different meanings. And then, of course, you do have malign actors driving this as well, be they state actors overseas, who are deliberately looking for the fault lines in our societies and then driving a bus through it on social media using bots and paid shills and that kind of thing. And then, of course, non-state actors as well are clearly taking out from the ISIS playbook. Actually, if we go back far enough, they had the digital jihad, which was incredibly effective in their PR, and they work that angle too. So it's very, very difficult once that perception and narrative is set to change someone's mind. And I think as a society, we need to start looking at kind of the hygiene of our information space, because it's so polluted right now that it's almost impossible to have a conversation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I couldn't agree more. It really is difficult. Um, in relation to, I guess, that kind of culture of appeasement, one might say, in relation to these movements and ideologies, um, what, in your view, might shake that? What might change that? I mean, you mentioned the piece you wrote for Spike, which is about the BBC and its coverage of the Iran war, and the fact that it's earned its lack of trust because of the way in which it covered the Gaza conflict, which was often unreliable, often quite hysterical. I think people will be familiar with that. And that kind of feeds into precisely the culture that we're talking about, because it gives people, I mean, the thing I always thought about the BBC is the impression it gave to people on the nightly news almost every night for 2.5 years is that the Gaza war is the only war taking place in the world, and it's the worst war that's ever happened. I mean, those were the two messages we were constantly fed on a loop. And that does feed into all of this. Do you see any way of dislodging this culture? I mean, is it a question of improving the media coverage, the media analysis, the public discussion? What do you think might kind of dislodge this culture of appeasement that we've seen over the past 2.5 years in particular?
Yeah, it's so challenging. It's so challenging. I mean, how do you start to unwind the clock? And it's a very big question as to whether you can. What I'd like to see, rather than whether I think it's going to happen or not, what I'd like to see is, first of all, some sort of accountability for media outlets that are genuinely failing in their duty to educate the public properly. What that looks like, whether it's losing the license fee or whether it's some kind of fine or whatever it might be, but there needs to be a house clearing, particularly in the state broadcaster. The Guardian are always going to do Guardian things. The Telegraph is always going to do Telegraph things, but you'd expect our state broadcaster to be bigger. And surely the government has some kind of statutory mechanism where they can make this happen. So that's the first thing I'd like, particularly when it comes to the BBC, who are different. Secondly, I'd like to see social media companies clean up their act, but it's very difficult to do. You'll run into free speech issues. You'll run into accusations of censorship and that. So that's really, really hard. And so all we're really left with is trying to educate people from the word go about the world they're about to enter. And that means children in schools and teaching them how to think critically, how to look at what they're seeing online, to understand that people are going to try and manipulate them, particularly emotionally. But again, it's very difficult to do. And I would say, though, that the kind of furor on this, it's a question as to whether we've actually opened Pandora's box or whether it's something that will die down once Gaza comes off the headlines. I think it might be the latter, kind of slightly optimistic in some aspects. I don't think the anti-Semitism being in the open is going away. I don't think the shrieking leftists are going to go away, but I think they are actually a minority. And my Jewish friends always tell me off for this, because for them, it's the center of the entire world and they're constantly abused. And I fully understand that. So I'm not trying to minimize the problem of anti-Semitism, but I don't think it's everyone. I do think it is a minority group. And now the kind of wider outrage about Gaza has died away because it's not on the headlines. What we're left is with this rump of anti-Semites. And we can pretty much put a finger on who they are and where they are. And that makes things a bit easier to counter. But also now Gaza's off the headlines, we can start to kind of just move on past it, and then we'll be left with just the people that are still shrieking, and then we'll really see them for who they are, because they're still shrieking about a war that isn't even happening anymore. And that really is the tell that there's something else going on other than just being upset about children in Gaza.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, absolutely. The more they expose themselves, the better, I think, for improving this entire discussion. Okay, Andrew, I just want to finish by just coming back to the regime in Tehran, and the future prospects there. I mean, what you said earlier on is something that I've been thinking about myself, which is that this is not a normal regime. I mean, I think there is a tendency, even amongst very sensible people in the West, to see it as a relatively typical ruling class that just happens to justify its rule through the language of jihadism or theocracy and so on. But it's not like that. And when you do have this almost cosmic, apocalyptic form of governance, that is a scary prospect. And it does, as you said earlier, it does lessen the prospects that they will say, okay, fine, you've got us, we'll put down our arms, we'll compromise to this, we'll compromise to that. How difficult do you think that could get? And do you think there's a sufficient understanding? Presumably there's a sufficient understanding amongst Israeli officials about this issue. Do you think there's a sufficient understanding amongst Western observers, even Washington, London, that that's what the regime is like, and therefore going to war against it is a pretty unusual prospect, and one that we've got to think about very carefully?
Well, let's start with London, actually. I think because we have been so incredibly weak when it comes to this regime. We haven't even shut our embassy there for a really weak excuse that, the Americans use it as a back channel, and that gives us influence in Washington. That's the Foreign Office line on this. I'm not convinced that it does give us huge amounts of influence in Washington, quite frankly. And the Foreign Office is stuffed full of people who want to be Lawrence of Arabia and are all massive Arabists. And that explains a lot of their anti-Israel perspective, in fairness, because they want to keep Qatar and Dubai on side. So that kind of explains the London position. We're just terrible because we've picked a side. We want the Arabs in our corner because they're richer. So there's a realpolitik to it. When it comes to Jerusalem, absolutely, the Israelis understand what they're up against. And they find it, from my conversations with some quite senior people, they find it intensely frustrating that what is obvious to them is not obvious to the West, about the nature of this beast. And we've seen images of people who look like the Iranian regime for 20 years now, because we were in Afghanistan for a long time. So we're used to seeing the flowing robes, the big beards. It's not kind of an alien thing for the West to see. And we're humans, and so we tend to put things in boxes that we recognize rather than try and find new data for our worldviews. And so it's very easy to put them in a box where we could buy off the Taliban. We did that repeatedly over 20 years, is pay off people not to fight us. And the Taliban, whilst they are extremists, they're of a slightly different color and nature and hue to what we've got in Tehran, which is why they don't get on particularly well. They've got very different versions of Islam that they adhere to. One is corruptible, one is absolutely single-minded, and that's the Iranians. Washington, I suspect, have had good conversations with the Israelis. They've been in lockstep for 2 years now. There's no way they don't understand this. But the big question is, what's Trump going to be happy with as an end state? He's got to try and do something about his polling for the midterms. He needs a win to walk away with here. The baseline is, however this ends, it needs to be something that Donald Trump can go back to America with and go, look what I achieved. Nobody else could have done this, just me, vote Republican. And no matter what happens on the ground, as long as Donald Trump can do that, then that's the outcome that Washington will want for this war. And so that's going to shape the direction of travel slightly, regardless of what actually happens to the mullahs in Tehran.
Andrew, thank you very much.
My pleasure.